Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. Now, I think all of us around the world have been checking our favorite newspaper or website or dashboard to get information on COVID-19 infections, deaths, and now, fortunately, changes in vaccination rates. And I tend to check two main websites, the New York Times and also the Washington Post. So I'm located right outside Washington, D.C., so the Post is sort of like my local newspaper. So I generally check the Post every day to see what's going on in my county here outside of Washington, D.C. But I also really enjoy, primarily because of the data visualizations, the dashboard over at the New York Times. And of course, in tracking these day-to-day infections and deaths and vaccines, the team over at the Times and lots of other media organizations have had to make lots of different decisions about the visuals that they're going to create and how they are going to communicate this information on a day-to-day basis. So I'm really excited to have Charlie Smart on this week's episode of the podcast. Charlie works on the New York Times graphics department. He is one of the team members working on their COVID-19 dashboard. He had a little bit of a Twitter thread some months ago about some of the changes they made to the color palette in the maps about the COVID-19 infections rates. And so that really spurred me to reach out to Charlie to see if he'd like to chat about the decisions that they've made in and around the dashboard. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Charlie. I think you're going to learn a lot about the insides of how Charlie and other members of the New York Times think about communicating COVID-19 data, which of course is sort of different than showing information about the unemployment rate or GDP, because COVID-19 information is potentially life-threatening. It's making life and death decisions about, am I going to wear a mask? Am I going to go outside? And am I going to, be around other people? So these are really important decisions that are driven by data. So I think you'll enjoy this week's episode of the podcast. And so here is my interview with Charlie. Hey, Charlie, how are you? Thanks for coming on the show.
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
I am really excited to talk with you about all this great work you and your team at the Times have been doing, specifically on the coronavirus tracking dashboard and all the other work that you've been doing. So we've got a lot to talk about. So maybe we can start by having you just talk a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got over to the Times. And then I will ping you with a series of questions to figure out how you've been managing all this data and data viz.
Sure. So I went to college for journalism and actually thought I wanted to do radio journalism when I was in school. I was, very into podcasts and NPR and did college radio and did my first journalism internship at an NPR affiliate in Connecticut. And while I was there, they found out that I, knew a little bit of like HTML and knew how to code like a little bit, but not really well at all. But they found that out, and so they asked if I could, build some tables for a story, and then, make some maps for a story. And I kind of, at that time, was sort of just learning that like data journalism was a thing. I had gone to a conference with some radio stations, some college radio folks earlier that year, and I'd seen actually someone from the Times graphics department speak there, and was like, "Whoa, this is really cool."
Yeah.
And so, kind of through doing this radio internship, kind of started doing the data and graphics journalism stuff. And just thought that was really cool and kind of did that work through college. And then when I graduated, I worked for a little while at a design studio in Boston that sort of does data visualization work, but in more of a design studio environment, not so much news. And then, did some freelance work and worked for a little while with the folks over at The Pudding. And was just kind of like, learning a lot of this stuff. Like, I think a lot of people there's no, I guess there are programs now that sort of focus on data visualization and this sort of journalism. But I think a lot of people are sort of, self-taught and kind of figure it out as they go along. And that's very much what I was doing. And I started at the Times a little over a year ago now in late 2019. And I was hired to focus on elections, to work on graphics for the primaries that were coming up at that time. And that lasted until I think the Florida primary was the last one that I directly worked on, which was March, I think 17th.
Okay.
Which was
so that was almost to the day of when everything shut down.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we'd been out of the office at that point for about a week. And New York had kind of shut down right around then. And that was when I switched over to working mostly on the coronavirus graphics. And that just sort of was dominating the news
Sure.
cycle and the things that we were covering at the time. And yeah, so I've kind of been working on a mix of coronavirus and elections things since then.
Right. Before we talk about the coronavirus stuff, do you miss the radio part of your early interests?
You know, I do like it's kind of fun to be on a podcast now.
Yeah.
I do miss I always love audio and radio as a medium, and I think there's people doing really cool work in that area, and I do definitely miss it. What I like about data journalism and visual journalism is that it sort of combines these like different interests I have in journalism and in design and programming, and kind of lets you do like a real mix of things, and you're not like siloed into one area, and you can kind of
Yeah.
move between these different things. So I really enjoy that, but I do miss college radio and that sort of thing.
Right. Have you and maybe this is premature, but have you thought about or talked about combining audio into some of the visual data visualizations at the times? I know Amanda Cox had done some years ago, had done some audio stuff, but it's not a very common form. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's not something that I can't speak for everyone in the department. I don't know like what else is going on. It's not something that I've been kind of focused on these
Right.
like larger dashboard projects, but
Yeah.
it's definitely an interesting. There's been some like interesting work I've seen sort of in that area.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the Times coronavirus tracker because there's a lot there. You're updating it every day, and then you've made some larger changes at certain points, and I'm sure some smaller changes over the course of the last. I mean, almost. We're in early March right now, so almost a year to the day since you've been doing it. So, can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the dashboard and some of the both the smaller changes, the maybe some of the tweaks that you had made, and then I know sort of in later in 2020 in November or so, there were some bigger changes that had to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the first thing I want to say about this project before I kind of get into talking about it is
Yeah.
that this is has been just a huge team effort. This project. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about are things that other folks have worked on. I don't know what the biggest byline ever on a New York Times story is, but this one takes up like most of the vertical space of my, browser window when you scroll down
Right.
to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's just so many people that are working on this, and I just want to make sure sort of everyone on this team sort of gets
Yeah.
credit for that.
Sorry, just before you dive in, I assume that's not just the people on the graphics team. Does that include like other reporters and folks from the health department sort of weighing in and helping give your team the perspective that you need to make sure you're representing the data in the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a cross department, like multiple desks working on this. We sort of have people from all over the newsroom contributing to this project in collecting data, in figuring out what the data means, and reporting out stories based on the data. So yeah, it's like a massive sort of cross newsroom effort, sort of similar to
Right.
like what might happen for like an election project or something like that, where
Gotcha.
it's such a big project that we have people from all over working on it.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of sort of the history of this project, we started tracking coronavirus cases in the United States in I believe late January, and this started out as literally a Google spreadsheet where people would go in, and every time there was a new case would add a row to the spreadsheet, and we're like reporting out this data very manually, and that we sort of very quickly realized that that was just not tenable in the
Yeah.
long term for this project as the virus started to spread. um, and so this is a part where we sort of worked with the team that does sort of more like database development at the times, and they helped us build a system to sort of more robustly in a real database sort of track these cases as they're coming in. And this was just data that didn't really exist in this like sort of unified form anywhere. We were tracking from every county, and part of this was that we needed to make it so that the data from different places in the country were comparable. So because things were being reported at a state level, different states would report things in different ways. So for example, some states might not include cases from people incarcerated in that state in their totals, and so we thought that those should go into the state totals. And so we did that work of adding those numbers that we reported out to the state numbers, and keeping those things sort of consistent across states. and also just doing lots of reporting on the way that states were reporting cases, whether they were reporting only confirmed cases or suspected cases, and same with deaths.
Right.
And so it was just like a huge reporting effort to collect these, and we started mapping these around that time. I think in like early March, we published the first U.S. coronavirus map, and it was a pretty simple map. It was just like circles over counties to show how many cases there were there. And I remember in the first map, actually, we highlighted states when they had a case to show like where in the country the virus had been to, and that feature quickly became sort of obsolete as
Yeah.
all 50 states had the virus, and so it's just sort of been this continuous shifting of responding to the changing nature of the pandemic and
Hmm.
responding to that in how we're graphing it.
Right.
Yeah, so then sort of later on in March, we started building out more maps. We made the maps like fully interactive. We added lots more charts. We started with just sort of this basic like case bar chart of cases per day, and we started building out sort of different views of that, more details on showing like the 7-day average of cases as this went on, and you need to know sort of trends and not just like daily figures. We added what we call like our sort of curve grid, which is the section that's like where cases are going up and where cases are going down. And then we started thinking about like other map views. It got to a
Hmm.
point sort of in like April, May, where for a while the virus had really been the sort of the epicenter was New York City and New York. And there got to be a point in like sort of the late spring of 2020 where New York had sort of gotten its situation somewhat under control, and the virus was spreading rapidly in other parts of the country. And at that point, we realized that the focus needed to not be on so much on case totals, but on sort of what's happening right now in my area.
Hmm.
So it's not just about like which place has had the most cases, because in that map New York always had the biggest bubble
Right.
because the spread had been so bad, but that didn't mean that things weren't bad in other places then. And so we started playing with different ways of showing that. So we tried different versions of the map showing we did a version of the map for a little while that color coded things by whether cases were going up or down, like daily case numbers, like sort of the change from the week before,
Hmm.
and how steeply they were going up. And that was good for a little while, but could be kind of confusing, we found. um, and we worked on organizing this curve grid by showing where cases are increasing, and then also we changed it to show not just where cases are increasing, but sort of adding this other dimension of like where cases are high and increasing, and where cases are still high but going down, because those are sort of like, just because something is going down doesn't mean things aren't bad there. um,
Right.
so just trying to
Right.
get as much of this information in as we could. And what we ended up doing for the map was we settled on sort of showing the number of cases per capita in the last 7 days and doing sort of a choropleth map based on that. And we thought
Hmm.
that was a pretty good way of showing sort of where, like, how bad are things near me right now compared to elsewhere in the country.
Right.
And so that's sort of what the map has largely been since, like, I think late May or early June was when we made that change.
So when you were going through these iterations, you had said earlier that you had found that this quite didn't work, and maybe this did work. When you say that you found that, was that just a collaboration within the newsroom, or were you asking people, asking New York Times readers to like help you all understand what they want, what works well for them? Or was it more this huge team of people in the Times newsroom saying, yeah, the pandemic's sort of moving in this direction. We can see things spreading across the states in this way, and this is not really representing the data as clearly as we want.
Yeah, it was sort of a combination of those things. It's we spend a lot of time thinking about this internally, and sketching lots of different possible ways of mapping and charting these things, and doing just lots of sort of experimentation to try to find the best way of showing this, and just discussing internally, like with people both on graphics and other reporters on other desks who are covering the story, kind of like what's the best way that we can be showing this, and what's most important to get across to people right now. But at the same time, this is a page that lots of people look at and lots of people look at every day, and so we do
Right.
get lots of reader feedback on these pages and are definitely responsive to that. If we see people are interested in seeing certain things or are confused about the way we're showing things, like we definitely take that into
Right.
consideration throughout this whole process.
Can I
um,
ask? This is a little bit of a like maybe too inside baseball, but I'm
mhm.
curious. I mean, the Times is read by millions of people around the world. Presumably, you're getting thousands, hundreds, or thousands, or hundreds of thousands of comments from people. How does that work? Is there a team that's going through those comments, and are they feeding them to you, the ones that they seem relevant? And then, like, if there's enough, presumably there's so many of them, are you actually like trying to quantify or visualize those comments, like so that you can help improve the tool? I mean, it's like it's data, it's its own kind of data, right?
Yeah, I mean, I I'm a little limited in like what I can say about like specifics of
Sure,
how
sure.
those sorts of systems work.
Yeah,
But yeah, we're definitely like, it's definitely something that we're responsive to. Like we're seeing what readers are asking about these
yeah,
things, and it's definitely something we think about and talk about during meetings when we're planning out how to do these things.
yeah.
Um,
Interesting.
another thing on the mapping design front and sort of the way things have changed, that I wanted to talk about is that sort of early on in the pandemic, when the virus was largely hitting cities on like New York and sort of large cities, and especially on the East Coast. We made a decision on the maps to add what's called a dasymmetric filter, basically, so that we were only showing areas on the map above a certain population, and so we were
Mm,
we were showing counties, but we had this sort of filter layer on top based on census block groups, and
right,
we were not filling in areas that very few people lived in. And the idea behind that was basically that you know uh, counties in the west are geographically much larger generally than counties in the east, and that there were in many of those counties like sort of contained outbreaks in things like prisons or in like meatpacking facilities. And we realized that by if we filled in the whole county in that color, it gave the impression that the virus was like very widespread in this place,
right,
when that wasn't really the case. And so we wanted to sort of have a visual filter to say, like, yes, the virus is here, but it's not like the entire state of Nevada
right,
is
right.
overrun by the coronavirus. And so
Yeah,
we
yeah.
we had this filter on the map, and I think for a while that was a really useful sort of visual tool to indicate that. But then there was this point in November, around the time when we made these other map changes,
Hmm.
that were basically what had happened was that for a long time, the virus, like I said, was sort of concentrated in the East Coast cities, and then sort of moved to the South. And there was a point in November where the Midwest started to get hit really, really hard by the virus. Like, Michigan, for example, had been seeing, through much of the summer, had been seeing like 700 cases a day. And in November, December, started seeing 7 or 8,000 cases a
Yeah.
day. And same with like South Dakota had gone from like 100 to like 1,500 cases a day. So just this huge increase in cases in a lot of these Midwestern states. And so that kind of caused two problems for our graphics. The first was that the states had sort of maxed out the scale we were using on the map, so you just couldn't see any variation anymore, and everything was
Right.
just solid red. And that's sort of, on the one hand, like, things were very bad there, and so having everything be red was not wrong, but it's also not especially useful if you live there to see, like, how is my county doing compared to other counties around it. And that's still information we wanted to get in there. Um, and it's always tough to make changes to these scales, because this is something that people look at every day, and people sort of become very used to these scales and sort of can kind of I think identify, like, they see the red value and they know that things are bad. And we didn't want to just like shift the scale down so that everything that was red became like orange again,
Hmm.
because people might see that and be like, oh, things are better.
Right.
um, so which was not the case.
Yeah.
So what we did instead was we added more values on top of the scale. We actually extended the color range into this sort of dark purple, and extended the values, and sort of did that not just linearly, but so that like the maximum values were like pretty high. And that sort of allowed us to get a little more range in the scale,
Hmm.
and allow for some of that. You can see the geographic variation in those places.
Right.
And the other thing we did was at that point, we decided to remove that asymmetric filter and just show all of every county. And the reason we did that was because the virus had moved from, largely urban areas to rural areas. And so these areas were being hit really, really hard by the virus. But they were not showing up, they were just showing up as a small little, like the one city in that county was showing up on
Yeah.
the map. And when we realized that was sort of misleading in the opposite direction that we had initially intended this to go. And this was another point where we sort of had some reader feedback from people who lived in, the Dakotas and places like that, where they were saying the virus is really bad in my area, but it's not showing up clearly on your map. Like, what can you do about that?
Right. Right.
And so that was when we decided to remove that layer, and we've kept the
The
map
filter.
like that since then. Yeah. um,
So hypothetically speaking, if you were working on a project where you had a similar scaling issue, where the line or whatever the value sort of punched its way through the maximum of your scale, but it wasn't the sort of dashboard where you thought people were checking it every day, right? Like or it's not, which we can talk about a little bit. It's not life threatening, right?
mhm.
Knowing how many goals the Cap scored last night isn't life threatening, right? But knowing how many infections are in my county is, potentially life threatening. So would you, if this wasn't that sort of dashboard, do you think you would have taken a different approach to that color challenge?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like, I think this is a really unique project in the way that people interact with it. Like, it's not, a news story where it publishes once and, people, a lot of people read it on the day that it publishes or in the week that it publishes. And then, it sort of has this like very quick drop off of readership.
Yeah.
Like, this is, very consistent, very, very consistent readership of people coming back to this, every day, every week, and checking it. And like I said, like, people, when you check something this often, people sort of begin to associate these colors with like the specific situations. And so it's,
Yeah.
it's hard to make those changes and to require people to sort of adjust their own mental model of how they
Hmm.
understand these graphics. So yeah, if this was, not a story that people were checking all the time, I think we probably would have just, adjusted the breaks on the scale, and that would have been that. It sort of requires you to like think a little differently of how you're making changes. And another really important part is just signaling very clearly that we are making changes. Like, even, when we
Hmm.
adjusted that scale, we included, a big note in a box on the top of the thing that's like, we adjusted the scale and here's the reasons why we had to do that. And that was when I posted that tweet thread too, sort of explaining that. And that was part of just like trying to get this message across of like what we changed and why we felt like we needed to change things at this point.
Does that notice still sit there, or was there a period of time where it's like, okay, so this has been existent for X number of days, and that's probably enough.
Yeah, it was there for a few weeks, I think, and then
Yeah.
we pulled it. But we
Okay.
still do things like that for other changes. Like, for example, counties in Iowa, the state of Iowa recently stopped reporting data at the county level in the
Hmm.
way that we need it for these maps, and is only reporting that sort of data at the state level. And so, we started showing Iowa on the maps as just a state where everything else is just
Yeah.
counties. Iowa, you hover
Counties.
over it, and it's just the state of Iowa. And so
Right.
that's another thing where, like, we really want to be clear about the messaging about why we're doing that, and that it's not just like we forgot about Iowa counties. It's like we're responding
Right.
to these ongoing changes in, the data collection and in the state of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I seem to remember early on that there was a day where there was like a big data dump, and so there are these big spikes in like multiple places. And I remember there being a big note that says, you know, February X, 25th is not really representative because it was like a big data dump that day.
Yeah, totally. That's a really, those, like, we call them like anomalies in data reporting. Like, the one thing about this is that this is a very messy data set.
Yeah,
Like, it's reported from so many different places, and it's inherently a hard thing to capture data for. And it's hard to track this data, and we're really trying our best to make this the most as useful as it can be. But it's a tough data source to work with. And a lot of the times, states might, for example, some states just don't report data on weekends, and so Mondays will have like a larger spike than other places, and
yeah,
that's why we use the 7-day average in most places to sort of smooth that out. And there are times when states will have sort of a backlog of tests that were never logged or reported, and we'll report those all at once, and they're from some indeterminate dates in the last month, and it'll just show up as a spike. And so when we know that that's happening, we have a team that does a lot of reporting around this data, not just collecting what states publish on their website, but also reporting on why is there a spike on this day. And when we're able to identify like the reason behind that, we have a system where we can sort of flag that day as like an anomalous day and include a note with that, and have it highlighted a different color on our charts, and have a little arrow pointing to it saying this day is an anomaly, and that we're not actually like 4 times as many cases on this day as the rest of the week. And
Right.
we think doing that sort of stuff is really important, because people, we don't want people to get the wrong message about the real state of the pandemic from this sort of these like sort of artificial spikes and dips in the data.
Yeah. Right. So, can you talk a little bit about the overall user experience of the visuals? Because in some of the views, it's a little bit more about comparing my state to another state, or my area to another area, and other views are here's just your area, right? Here's just Virginia or New York State. So, how do you all think about balancing those two types of users? Who some users probably want to make a comparison, and some users just want to know, like, is it okay for me to go to the restaurant today?
Yeah, it's like I think there's a range of reasons that you look at these dashboards. I think the main sort of US dashboard page with the big map at the top is really useful for just getting a picture of like how is the United States in general doing in the coronavirus. We lead with like the sort of the curve, like the waves of the virus, like that main chart at the top that's become sort of a symbol of like how well are we doing compared to the spring, compared to the peak in the winter. And we lead with this map that's just sort of the big map of where is the virus worse in the country right now.
Hmm.
And so those pages are useful for just getting sort of an overall picture of the virus in this country, and sort of and also we have the world page too, where you can see sort of that on like the global scale of like where is it worst in the world right now. And we do also publish these pages for like subnational geography for some other countries too,
Hmm.
when we're able to get that data. So those are good for just sort of giving an overview of like how is the virus affecting this place right now. But we also know that people want information about where they're living. Like it's this is not just data that's interesting in the abstract. It's like very useful specifically to people's lives and day-to-day decision making. And so this is something we've always had these sort of a page for every state in the country, and that sort of was like the first level of like personalization that we had, that you can go to your state and see how are coronavirus cases in New York right now. And we actually have a page for New York City specifically, because we're able to get zip code level geography for there. But more recently, in the last 5 months or so, we've been focusing more on like very detailed personalization. So in late November, we published a page that lets you search for counties that you're interested in and create sort of a personalized dashboard
Hmm.
of counties interesting to you. And so you might look up the place where you live, and the place where your parents live, and where your siblings live, and just have like these sort of locations that are relevant to you in there. And that just sort of gives you like the very basic information of like how bad are things right now, what direction are things trending, how are things compared to the peak of the virus, just the sort of like sort of at a glance core information. And we also have that in a newsletter where you can get your personalized places,
Right.
just that very simple data sent to you. And that's like I think very useful for people. And then we also in I think December, the Department of Health and Human Services started releasing very detailed hospital data on like sort of at the specific single hospital level of COVID data. So that includes things like, what percent of ICU beds are available, how many COVID patients are there, what share of the patients there are COVID patients. And so we started publishing, we initially published a map showing that at the hospital service area level, which is just sort of a kind of small geographic unit that usually has between like, 1 and 10 hospitals in it. and just showing like, kind of a choropleth map of how bad things are. And then we wanted to get even more detailed and show, at the individual hospital level, like how bad are the specific hospitals in my area. And so we made a map that lets you search for, your address and shows you the hospitals closest to you. And we kind of used a new sort of visual tool in that, where you can sort of pan around the map, and there's sort of a column on the left hand side that updates some sort of summary statistics of the hospitals you're looking at, sort of like if you can imagine like panning around in Google Maps and seeing like the places that you're looking at update in that little sidebar, sort
Right.
of similar to that idea. And then the most recent step we've taken in sort of the personalized view of this is that earlier this year we started publishing a page for every county in the United States. So we're now publishing over 3,000 tracker pages multiple times every day.
Mm.
And that was a sort of large effort to make that technically feasible, to make things fast and efficient enough to be able to update these and publish these. And those pages focus, they give you sort of the overview data that the rest of the tracker pages do, but they also focus on specifically on risk. We worked with, health researchers at Johns Hopkins to sort of determine a way to calculate sort of risk levels based on a number of factors, cases, testing, things like that. And then based on those risk levels, we give very specific advice on what activities are safe and not safe, and how people can protect themselves based on the current situation in their area. And so we're really trying to give people information that's not only interesting and gives a picture of how the virus is doing nationally, but also very useful and actionable. That it's, instead of saying like there's been 50 cases in your county today, you might not know like what that means, or it's like, what do I do with this information? But if instead we
Yeah.
say, your county is at an extremely high risk level, and here are the things that you should and shouldn't do right now, like that's information that we think is very useful to readers, and that's kind of what we want to be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, when I go to the tracker page, and I don't know if this is because I'm logged into my account as a subscriber, or it's because I've done a search for my county in the past, or it's the IP or whatever it is. But definitely, when I get to that part, it says, right now it's saying that my county is at a very high risk, and it's like red and bold in that little teaser. And when you click over there, you get this this basically this big headline that's like in all red, very high risk. So it's definitely like, pointing my attention to my area.
Yeah, that's, I mean, even I think you talked about like on the homepage, like that's something that we've been, there's a lot of design work has gone into that little homepage widget of showing like, we
Mm-hmm.
have, and it's not just, we don't just have like the case tracker pages, we also have lots of other tracker pages for vaccines, and for colleges and nursing homes and metro areas, and we have like
Right.
many different trackers that we're publishing. And so we want to be able to use that homepage widget to highlight the things that are interesting, or that are recently updated, or that are specific to your location, when we're able to get that location or have you search for it. Like, we want this to just be like a very quick and useful little bit of information, like those little like sparkline arrows on the homepage
Yeah.
dashboard, just to show like how are things now, how are they compared to last week. Like, those are just sort
Right.
of like very pieces of information that are every day sort of useful and interesting for people.
It's interesting in a lot of ways, because it almost feels like the trackers are more of a public health resource than news reporting in sort of the traditional sense of, here's the story of what's going on in this particular county. It feels like you have all taken this as your responsibility as experts in this field of data communication, and being able to wrangle the data and the technology to provide this resource that one might think that the CDC or the Department of Health and Human Services would have on their webpage. But it seems like you've all taken this responsibility of being this gatekeeper in some sense of this coronavirus information.
Yeah, and like we definitely are like very aware that people use this as a resource, and we want to make it as useful as possible. The other thing we do is that we every day we publish this data on a GitHub page, so that folks are able to use it for research, or for their own analysis. Like, we want this data to be out there, and for people to use it and make use of it. And we also, like, this is definitely a sort of resource both for the public and for us inside the newsroom. Like we, report stories based on this data and based on these dashboards, every day.
Right.
Like we have people working on, just looking at these numbers and seeing interesting trends and, using both the sort of visualizations we've created and also just the sort of raw data. And, we have teams both on graphics and on other desks that are using this data all the time for reporting and for doing the more sort of traditional journalism
Right.
with this information.
Right.
And so it's great to be able to support both the sort of public need for this information and the ability of the Times to publish work based on this.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a couple more quick questions. Well, I don't know if this first question is that quick, but I have one quick question before we end. But um, when you and the folks you work with started creating these trackers, did you have a different feeling or a different approach to creating this tracker and creating the visualizations in the sense that, like you just mentioned, people are using this as a resource and it's potentially life-threatening information, right? I mean, this virus is, has killed more than 500,000 people in the United States alone. It's not like, sports scores or the stock market, which is interesting and it's useful for lots of people, but not going to affect my personal health or the health of my family in a direct sense. So, do you feel that way? Do you approach it that way? Or do you try to put that aside and say, this is, it's another news story that we're working on?
No, I mean, I definitely think like it's definitely hard to ignore the sort of implications of this data that we're working with. Like
Yeah.
you know, um, there have been times where when we're approaching one of these big milestones of case numbers or death numbers that we're updating this and we want to you know be able to update it so that people are aware of these milestones, but it's also like it's terrible to watch these numbers go up in real time as we're pulling in this data,
Right.
and it's definitely like it's sort of hard to ignore the fact that these are real people with a terrible virus. And so I think we just have to kind of focus on communicating this information like as clearly and in as useful a way as we can. It's a news story, and it's important
Right.
information that we have to get across. One thing that we're doing in this project actually that I think is interesting is that we offer these pages in both English and Spanish. So we have Spanish translations for these pages, which I think is really important because this is such crucial information, and we want as many people as possible to be able to access it. And that was
Hmm.
sort of a challenge in building this, in that none of the text on these pages are like hard coded in anywhere. Like we built a whole system to be able to swap out the translations for everything from
Oh,
the
interesting.
main copy of the story to the individual chart labels are all translated to.
Right.
And so we thought that was really important as part of the sort of service that we're doing. On a sort of technical level, an interesting thing that sort of makes this different from a traditional news story is that there's copy on these pages. Like there's charts as well as sort of explanatory copy, but a good chunk of that copy is actually like generated. Like we have scripts that we run that generate sentences based on the data, and basically that lets
Hmm.
us like keep this copy for all these pages fresh and up to date with the latest information without having an editor have to go through and update the copy on 3,000
Right.
pages every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so it lets us sort of communicate this information not just in charts, but give sort of a little more explanation, but in a way that's like sustainable long term for us to keep these updated. I think that's been a big sort of constant challenge in this project, is just keeping this in a way that as this project grows and as the data grows and the number of pages we're publishing grows, just being able to keep on this cycle of updating 4 times a day and
Right.
keeping the data as fresh as possible is something that we're constantly thinking about and thinking of ways we can improve. And we're making changes right now to slim down the sizes of files that we're sending to users so that we can that the page loads faster on your phone. Like we just want people to be able to get this data and this information sort of as easily as possible in a way that's as useful to them as possible.
Yeah. I think there's a whole technology side of this tracker that I think is fascinating for lots of different people for lots of different reasons. I think a few years ago, having copy that would up where the numbers in the copy would update automatically was a very new thing, and people were very excited about how the graph and the data and the text actually interact with one another. And you all have sort of done that. You sort of taken that all the way to I don't want to say the endpoint because I don't know what the endpoint is, but you've taken that all the way where it's basically automating this whole thing, and it's just a really interesting technology that I would suspect that many data viz folks would be interested in doing in their own work because it does allow you to more integrate those two things together.
Yeah, I think actually in some way because we at the Times have done sort of live elections results pages for so long, and have a lot of
Yeah.
sort of institutional experience working on those sorts of things. I think, obviously it's a very different set of data and a different set of needs that you're communicating, but like those generated sentences were something that we had started using in the primaries this year.
Hmm.
And that just seemed like a natural thing to bring into these coronavirus dashboards, and a lot of like the sort of mapping techniques from like a technical perspective are things that we pulled in from these other sort of experiences in making these sort of large dashboards that are the sort of thing that people check regularly and have new data coming into regularly. And so I think that was sort of a useful background to be able to do this, especially on such a tight time frame when we were first getting these pieces out. And it was like there was a very high sense of urgency, especially a lot of us being located in New York, that things were so bad here that we really needed to get these pages out.
Yeah. Okay, I've got one last question for you. You might not be able to answer this question, but we'll see. You might say all of it. So when I go to the main Times tracker page, there are more or less, just to boil it down to like three main graphics. There's the map, county level map, and as you noted, not for Iowa right now, but county level map. Then there's a series of small multiple little line charts for cases going, getting higher, going lower for all the different states. And then the third sort of main visual is these little stripe charts for each state, and sort of like this really, what I think is a really cool table. So from those three sort of main sections, do you have a favorite part of the from a data viz perspective, not from the impact of the virus, but from a data viz and even technology perspective? Do you have a favorite part of the page?
So I, on a sort of personal level, I mostly work on the maps, and so I think the maps have been very useful, especially at different points of the virus, in showing, just in highlighting like where in the country things are worse. And I think that's a very easily understandable visualization. I do think
Yeah.
the small multiples, the sort of curve grid we call it, is maybe one of the most useful things on the page, in that it shows at the level of like each state, it shows both the curve of cases in that place, but also I think the way that we group them is extremely useful. And this was something that I talked about earlier, where it's not just like the direction, but it's grouped by both direction and sort of how bad things are. And I think people there's a time when there was just no states in the like where cases are low.
Hmm.
Maybe the U.S. Virgin Islands was in that, but there was hardly any places in the like cases are low area, and that was something that I saw lots of people tweeting about and responding to. That it was just bad everywhere at that point, and
Right.
everything was going up, and it was really sort of striking just to see sort of how these move around between those sections. And so I look at that section a lot. I think the table is useful as like I know this is what you were saying, I'm just going to say all of them, but I do think they're all useful for sort of for different reasons. I think the table is
Yeah,
good
yeah,
as like
yeah. No,
a
I think
quick
that's right.
overview.
Yeah,
And
for different reasons, for different people doing different things, right? Which
yeah,
is yeah,
that's like really the big part of this, is that we know we have a very large audience that's looking at this, and that everyone sort of has different needs and different interests, whether it's like you want to know is it safe to see friends outside or not, or
right.
just trying to figure out like your day-to-day decision making versus someone who's looking at this to get a sense of how things are doing in the whole country versus epidemiologists who might just want the data, and so we publish the data separately from the whole visual presentation of it. I think we have spent a lot of time thinking about like how each piece functions and sort of what the different needs of different users are. um, the one other part that you didn't mention is the very top chart. That's just the sort of curve and those top figures. And I think like as a sort of I feel like this curve has just become sort of like a symbol in a lot of people's minds of the virus, and just sort of like these different waves of it. And you can kind of like I know at least for me, like I can remember like, sort of memories of like, what things were like at the top of that, second wave or at the first wave in April. And, sort of have a lot of like associations with this curve specifically.
Right.
So, I think all the parts of it kind of function together to make a tool that we think is pretty useful for people. And we hope that people, are able to use to get information that they need.
Yeah, that's great. Charlie, thanks so much for coming on the show. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, and it is a remarkable project. And congrats on working on that. And hopefully, you'll get to maybe work on other things at some point. If you're
Yeah,
the time. So
I hope so.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great talking to you.
And thanks to everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll take a look at all the links and resources that I put in the episode notes of this week's episode of the podcast, and go check out the New York Times COVID-19 dashboard so you can see all the things that we talked about in this discussion. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening. A number of people help bring you the PolicyViz podcast. Music is provided by the NRIs, audio editing is provided by Ken Skaggs, and each episode is transcribed by Jenny Transcription Services. If you would like to help support the podcast, please share it and review it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The PolicyViz podcast is ad-free and supported by listeners. If you'd like to help support the show financially, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/PolicyViz.